welcome into the Guilty as Charged podcast here. Bolt breakdowns on the YouTube channel. You know what it is, once a week video. Sort of my show on the channel here at this point, but I wanted to do this video as sort of my next topic. We are less than a month away from 2023 free agency for the Chargers, and Steven and Tyler are working on great draft content. We're going to be working on free agency content and everything here. It's hard to believe it's the offseason that we're already starting to get back into the cycle of things here in the offseason. Just 1 year after the Chargers spent all of the money in 2022 free agency. I remember we did a very fun post JC Jackson signing show, and then during that podcast they signed Austin Johnson and they signed Sebastian Joseph-Day while we were live. Very fun times all around. The Khalil Mack trade was a big live stream as well. Some of those moves have aged well. Some of those moves maybe are somewhere in the middle. Some of them, But I did kind of want to review 2022 free agency and kind of contrast it with what the Chargers are going to do this year, right? Because the Chargers entered free agency last year as a team that had a lot of money, could basically cut some contracts, get more money, right? Not the position they're going to be in this year, right? They're going to be functioning as a team that's $23 million over the salary cap. It is going to have to restructure / cut some contracts as a way to get cap compliant. And if they want to sign any external free agents, figure out, some craftier ways to make moves rather than just be like, here's 10 million, here's 16 million, right? In terms of average annual value, here's 40 million in guarantees, here's 20 million in guarantees, right? Not what they're going to be able to do this year, but things will, kind of be different. So, we'll be bringing the coverage of all of that on the channel and more as we get into free agency. But I sort of wanted to review how last free agency went for the Chargers and, what lessons they can apply, I guess, this year as they, sort of enter this, as I would call it, functioning differently type of free agency. All right, so without any further ado, I do have my Bolt Beat article pulled up. I did write a Bolt Beat article grading each signing individually, so I'll sort of get into my reasons why. For the structures of YouTube ad time, I'm going to go from least important to most important. So if you want JC Jackson stuff, go to the end of the video. But I did want to bring up the special teams guys first. We don't talk about them a lot in terms of how expensive they were as signings because they weren't, Troy Reeder, as you see, gets here $25K guaranteed. DeAndre Carter, $100,000 guaranteed. J.K. Scott, $0 guaranteed. Josh Harris, they made special teams money. Josh Harris actually got one of the most lucrative contracts, I believe, for a long snapper in history at the time, with $1.9 million guaranteed. So that it's kind of interesting. But overall, all of these signings are really A, quality for the Chargers. If we want to go to the individual grades that I gave for each of them, I gave Troy Reeder an A- first. 1 year, $1.1 million, $25K guaranteed. He was really important in Ryan Ficken's special teams formula. And, as the Chargers, if they want to re-sign him in 2023, could also play a role on defense this year, depending on what happens with Drew Tranquill. But as a Staley guy, as a Ficken guy, Troy Reeder did really well this year on special teams. Not a whole lot more I can say other than the physical nature that he brought to it. If you watch the tape, obviously did not show up a lot on defense because he didn't play that much on defense with Murray and Tranquill sort of being your starters. But I thought he brought a great physical point of attack on those special teams plays, special teams reps, and was well worth the contract the Chargers gave him. So I gave him an A-. DeAndre Carter, I gave him an A grade here. So DeAndre Carter, they signed him to a 1 year, $1.1 million deal. I think they signed him around the same time as Reeder, so it was a little bit before the draft, in the middle of free agency, around that April period. And DeAndre Carter was sort of supposed to be their wide receiver 5, KJ Hill, Andre Roberts type guy that maybe contributed to the offense at some points, but was not expected to be the wide receiver 3 or wide receiver 1 or 2 in games this year like he was because of Keenan Allen and Mike Williams' health and Jalen Guyton obviously getting hurt. And he turned that into 55 yards, 48 receptions, I believe, and 538 yards. Was a top 10 punt returner for what it's worth. So I think there are people who will point out specific miscues and drops that DeAndre Carter had in big moments, but for the money that the Chargers were paying for him, as someone who's a near league minimum guy. The Chargers got all the production that they could have asked for and more, I think, out of DeAndre Carter, and he was part of that Ryan Ficken special teams revolution. And, considering how, tight the team was, when Mike Williams and Keenan Allen were both out, DeAndre Carter stepped up in a pinch. I don't know if he'll be back next year. We'll see what their plans are for drafting wide receivers this year. But, would like to see him back in some role if he is to be that wide receiver 5 special teams guy that he was intended to be, depending on, what they do with the rest of the receiver room. We'll see. And then, of course, J.K. Scott and Josh Harris. J.K. Scott, again, one of the best punters in the league this year statistically. Maybe not like an elite top 5 guy, but got great hang time. The Chargers allowed, I think, the fewest punt return yards in the league with opponents, with 58 yards on 19 returns from J.K. Scott, meaning that opposing teams averaged just over 3 yards per carry. So the hang time king proved Ryan Ficken right, and the Chargers kind of recovered from their Darius Swinton era last year. So J.K. Scott, nothing but nice things to say about him. A grade for me. Josh Harris, 4 years, $5.6 million, $1.9 million guaranteed. Pricey contract for a long snapper, but in the same vein of what I've talked about with their other special teams additions last year, hey, if you can keep this Josh Harris, Cameron Dicker, J.K. Scott nucleus at punter, kicker, and long snapper going for a while, and you got that consistency, then I'm very much fine spending that $1.9 million and giving him that 4-year, $5.6 million deal. Record for long snappers. Let the long snappers get their money. Why don't you just let the long snappers hold the dollar? But yeah, so I mean, you talk about all their special teams additions, all of them A in quality for me, from Ryan Ficken, Brandon Staley, and Tom Telesco. This is where we start getting into the serious money. Of course, we talk about Sebastian Joseph-Day was the second biggest contract financially the Chargers gave in 2020 to external free agency last year. That's another thing I should classify here. Khalil Mack, obviously a trade. Chargers signed some of their internal free agents, but for the purposes of this video, I'm just talking about their external guys. So when I say that the Chargers gave out $80 million in total guarantees last year in free agency, that actually is not including Khalil Mack or some of the other moves that they made in internal free agency, in which case we would be talking about a number that's well over $100 million in terms of total guarantees that they gave out last year, or acquired and signed to their team. But yeah, so this is just external free agents, and Sebastian Joseph-Day came over from the Rams. 3 years, $24 million, $16.5 million guaranteed. It's kind of a tough year to analyze for Sebastian Joseph-Day. And what I mean by that is you sort of look at his year, and he was good as a run stopper, right? Statistically good as a run defender too. But the Chargers were a bad run defense. But the reason the Chargers were a bad run defense, partially because of how Staley called things, but also they experienced really, really intense attrition, on the interior, and had a bunch of defensive linemen either get injured, get cut like Jerry Tillery did. And overall, Sebastian Joseph-Day was really the only consistent force who was there the entire season, along with Morgan Fox, who we'll get to in a bit. But Sebastian Joseph-Day overall had a good run stopping year. I believe he had the 14th most run stops out of about 50 qualified nose tackles. So overall, played above average in that regard. The thing that I think will be interesting to watch with Sebastian Joseph-Day is as a pass rusher. Now, Sebastian Joseph-Day, ultimately, they brought him in as a nose tackle, right? He's not going to be the guy who is going to be getting consistent pass rushing pressure. But I do think they need a little bit more than what they got from him in that area this year. So this is actually a chart from, I think, Seth Walder. Yes. And so this is talking about double team rate versus pass rush win rate. So if you can kind of see this chart here, Sebastian Joseph-Day essentially got double teamed the least in the league, but also put up the worst pass rush win rate productivity. And yeah, he is a nose tackle, but you would still like to see that value higher for him. Now, again, like we talked about with run defense, a lot of, the Chargers pass rushing problems were not having Joey Bosa. We're not having their interior guys aside from Sebastian Joseph-Day. and their depth was really tested. The only guy who was consistent there from game 1 to game 17 on the defensive line in general was Khalil Mack. And I would also say Morgan Fox in that regard. But everyone else was kind of in and out of the lineup. Season-ending injuries galore when you look at the defensive line room. And so, but at the same time, we just mentioned Morgan Fox. And Morgan Fox was getting double-teamed a lot more than Sebastian Joseph-Day was, while also having a significantly higher pass rush win rate if you look at this chart and where Morgan Fox is situated versus Sebastian Joseph-Day. So it's worth pointing out that as a pass rusher, strictly, he had about 3 more pass rushing pressures on 372 more snaps than he had as a Ram last year. So overall, you can kind of say he regressed a little bit as a pass rusher. But again, context dependent, and you can't just completely remove the fact that when we talk about Sebastian Joseph-Day, as a player as a whole, you're also talking about the rest of the defensive line. I ended up giving Sebastian Joseph-Day a B minus as I wrote about here, which is still a good signing. But for the second most expensive signing of Chargers free agency, I don't know how we'll look at that contract or Joseph-Day a year from now. But overall, I think you're talking about it as though it's a good contract. I don't think it's necessarily a great one. But then again, with both Joseph-Day and Austin Johnson, I think the Chargers, relative to the market, had to overpay slightly for some form of a defensive interior presence. We just talked about all the attrition and injuries the Chargers experienced on the defensive line when we talked about Sebastian Joseph-Day and Austin Johnson. Unfortunately, part of that hurting his MCL and fracturing his kneecap against the Atlanta Falcons, therefore ending his year. But he was given a 2-year, $14 million deal, $10.6 million of which is guaranteed. Like Sebastian Joseph-Day, I think you saw enough of him as a run stopper, a little bit more from Austin Johnson than Sebastian Joseph-Day as a pass rusher as well. You did see a little bit more from him in that regard. And I think the Chargers kind of, relative to the market, did overpay slightly for Austin Johnson. But ultimately, for what you're getting out of him, I think it's worth it. I think his injury will be fine to come back from, right? He's still relatively young. It's not a patellar tendon injury like we'll talk about later. But, the interesting question with this contract, and Telesco did give himself a little bit of flexibility with this 2-year deal, is that the Chargers can theoretically save $3 million if they wanted to move on from Austin Johnson in their cuts this year. I did the cut candidates primer video last week if you would like to check that out. But it's going to be interesting to see what they do here. I do ultimately think they'll keep Austin Johnson. It's like, yeah, you can save $3 million, but I would rather have like a really good interior player than $3 million, right? And then you're using that money to try to go find another interior player in free agency or through the draft, however it might be. So, the thing with, opening up holes, on a boat is eventually you have to fill that hole with something else, right? Even if you are saving that $3 million in the interim. But Austin Johnson and Sebastian Joseph-Day, overall a pair of very good signings. For contract value and money-wise, I give Austin Johnson a B. Kind of a TBD depending on his injury this year as well. But Sebastian Joseph-Day, I kind of gave a B- in terms of the total guarantees that were given in that contract. But overall, 2 very good players that will be on the Chargers defensive line, I believe, this year. And should everyone stay healthy, fingers crossed, knock on wood, I would expect those contracts to pan out. This might be my favorite signing of Chargers free agency. Is not the big, $40, $50 million contract guys, the big $20 million contract guys. It's Morgan Fox. Morgan Fox was signed for 1 year, $1.2 million, $100,000 guaranteed. In real time, he was signed about 2 weeks after the Chargers turned down the 5th-year option on defensive tackle Jerry Tillery. In the midst of all the chaos and Tillery getting cut mid-season and all the injuries on the defensive line, Morgan Fox had the best season of his career. He had 40 pressures, 7 sacks, second on the team to just Khalil Mack in sacks. He was a boss on the interior defensive line. There's not much more to say other than that. As a pass rusher, I showed you guys the pass rush win rate chart when I, in terms of double teams, when I talked a little bit about Sebastian Joseph-Day. But that, Morgan Fox was, pretty high for the Chargers. The price the price the Chargers paid for him in terms of the value that they got out of his per snap production. And ultimately, really, really paid off for the team. And I can't imagine where this interior defensive line would be if the Chargers don't make this call for one of Staley's guys, on the defensive side of the ball, especially considering they didn't really go like pass rushing DT in the draft, right? They went with Otito Ogbonya, who unfortunately got hurt with the torn patella tendon, but he was sort of brought in to maybe assume a bit of a Justin Jones role in the defense, right? He wasn't going to be like a primary pass rusher. So getting Morgan Fox when they did, because of how the Tillery contract, the Tillery situation, I should say, imploded later on and all the defensive injuries they experienced, Morgan Fox was super important. And for the value they got him at just $100,000 guaranteed, $1.2 million against the cap total, that's an A grade for me. I don't believe in A pluses for what it's worth. The college system just goes to A. There is no A plus at the school that I attend. You just get an A. So I have vindicated A pluses. So if you want me to give an A plus, just know that I've basically already given one, but I don't believe in the principle of them. All right. I want to talk about another post-draft signing along with Morgan Fox, who the Chargers signed in May. About a week after the draft, the Chargers also signed Bryce Callahan for a similar 1-year, $1.2 million contract, $150,000 guaranteed. You got to give this one an A too. They did go get Jot Taylor and Dean Leonard in the draft and sort of tried to build their cornerback depth that way. But they had this big established hole when Chris Harris Jr., was allowed to walk. I don't think he ended up signing anywhere else. But the Chargers basically like, look, we have this hole. Maybe Jot Taylor a year from now will be able to take it. Maybe one of our quarterbacks a year from now will be able to take it. But we need an established guy. They go get Bryce Callahan. Now, one of the reasons Bryce Callahan was a little bit of a decline point in the market, right? The Chargers didn't end up paying all that much for him was because of his injuries in Denver and the ability to trust whether he would stay healthy. The Chargers ultimately are the team that ends up taking the chance on that, so to speak, and takes a risk, and it pays off. That he gives them top 10 slot cornerback play for essentially, like we talked about with DeAndre Carter and some of these other guys, league minimum money. And I think when you talk about how, obviously J.C. Jackson goes down during the season, Michael Davis is reshuffled to cornerback 1, Asante Samuel Jr. gets moved around a little bit. Bryce Callahan just locking down that slot from day one cannot be overstated its importance with the rest of the turbulence in the secondary and in the cornerback room in particular. So I give the Bryce Callahan and Morgan Fox contracts both strong A's from me. Gerald Everett. So before we get to the big one and talk a little bit about J.C. Jackson, Gerald Everett was given a 2-year, $12.3 million deal, $8 million of which was guaranteed. Set a single season high, career high in yards and receptions, 555 yards, 555 yards, 58 receptions after he took over for Jared Cook for only a $4 million cap hit in 2022. I also think that's something that you can't leave out when you talk about Gerald Everett in particular, is how much better of a blocker he is than Jared Cook, who could not block, unfortunately, for most of his career, but also particularly his time here. That was one of his big weaknesses. So Gerald Everett, much better in that regard. And I think when you talk about Gerald Everett, I think the Chargers did a really, really good job with this contract of balancing their needs for the future with what they need right now, right? Tom Telesco needed immediate contributions, to replace Jared Cook and sort of get the Chargers tight end room rolling. But, at the same time, he also had to consider, hey, what if I like one of the tight ends in round 1 or 2 next year? Is Gerald Everett really a long-term guy? I think he balanced that really well. And so now the Chargers have options with Gerald Everett, right? I talked about this in my cut candidates video. They can save $4.25 million if they decided to cut him, either with a pre or post June 1st designation. But they could cut him. They could bring him back if they want to. They could bring him back and then draft a tight end still in the first round. They can, decide to make that move and then potentially trade Gerald Everett if they wanted as well. So the Chargers, with that contract, got the immediate production that they needed from Gerald Everett as a pass catcher and, more importantly, as a blocker over Jared Cook, and also have the flexibility to kind of, do what they want going forward in 2023 here. So we'll be very curious to see what they do with Gerald Everett, as I mentioned in my cut candidates video. So I gave Gerald Everett signing a B+. Kyle Van Noy, the last kind of minor signing, so to speak, before we get to the big one. 1 year, $2.3 million, $2.3 million guaranteed. And there was a time where the Kyle Van Noy signing looked like kind of a bust, right? Obviously, he sort of was the edge 3, then kind of gets reshuffled to edge 2 following Joey Bosa's injury. And overall, you look at Kyle Van Noy's first 9 games, they weren't great, right? He was racking up 10 pressures, had 0 sacks in his first 9 games. But over those last 8 games, over the last 2 months of the season, Kyle Van Noy has 22 pressures, 5 sacks in 5 consecutive games, as we saw in the last month of the season. And so as I wrote about here, like the unfortunate part when we talk about Kyle Van Noy is that him turning it around might put the Chargers in a bad position, because it might make him a little bit more expensive for next year compared to what he probably would have been. And edge is a really valuable position around the league too, right? So are the Chargers going to pay, all these guys at edge a lot of money when they're already paying Khalil Mack and they're already paying Joey Bosa to $20 to $25 billion cap hits each, right? That's something we're going to have to see. But if we're just talking about what they got out of that $2.3 million contract, the value that they got out of Kyle Van Noy down the stretch of the season too, he was probably the best Chargers third pass rusher option on a team since Uchenna Nwosu. And played second option for large portions of this season. So hopefully if the Chargers do have to replace Kyle Van Noy because of finances and just how the business works as a whole, I hope that they can get someone who is as productive as him, either for the cost or figure that situation out in general. But they definitely need a much more reliable edge 3 like Kyle Van Noy on this team behind Joey Bosa and Khalil Mack, as they age, as Joey Bosa's body, kind of gets more injured. They just can't roll with like Chris Rumph next year and hope it's okay. You do need a bona fide edge 3 type of player. And, the last contract that I do want to talk about is J.C. Jackson. J.C. Jackson, I talked about how the Chargers spent $80 million guaranteed on external free agents last year, and $40 million guaranteed of that $80 million was J.C. Jackson on a 5-year, $82.5 million total deal. And J.C. Jackson was the prized, possession of Chargers free agency when they went out and made that splurge. We talked about it as though he was kind of the final piece that was missing of Brandon Staley's defense. But, unfortunately, as things played out, didn't go as planned, right? He gets that ankle surgery earlier in the season, tries to get reintegrated into the Chiefs game, then has, kind of a string of poor performances, has the Denver game as well, where he ends up getting benched for Michael Davis. And then just as he's starting to find his form against Seattle, unfortunately experiences probably one of the worst injuries a cornerback or a wide receiver can experience in a torn patellar tendon. And that's just really a bummer for JC and for the Chargers as a whole. But as we talk about the situation now, we have JC Jackson who was not playing like cornerback 1, like he was playing in New England, prior to the injury, and now faces a long journey back. Just basically got back on a bike prior to the playoffs with the torn patellar tendon surgery. It's going to be a long climb back for him. He's most likely not going to be 100% by the time the Chargers kick off in 2023. Obviously he'll try to kind of play, but he's really not going to be, he may never be the same level of JC Jackson again, but when you have that kind of scale of knee injury, it's a year after to when you can possibly get back to normal. So the odds are against him with the torn patellar tendon, and that's really unfortunate. But the fact that he wasn't playing all that well before then, there are some of the off the field concerns with JC Jackson, which I'm not going to get into, but people know what the off the field concerns with JC Jackson are, if you've kind of been following that story. But I kind of would get giving JC Jackson an incomplete grade, right? Like we see in school, like kind of need to see more to make heads or tails of this contract. But, if you look at over the cap, and I'll share my screen regarding the JC Jackson contract here, they signed him for 5 years. They expected to get 3 or 4 years of production out of that. Arjun and the guys at PFF do a great job with, how many years of a contract is a player expected to play when they sign with that team. And, J.C. Jackson was expected to get 3 or 4 years of that production out of the cap hits before potentially maybe they would cut him in year 4. But, if you're talking about a post-June 1st cut, considering the situation with the knee injury, considering all these things that we've talked about in decline in play, the Chargers can save $14 million if they end up cutting him with a post-June 1st designation in 2024. And the fact that we've gotten to that point potentially with J.C. Jackson, I think is really sad how the situation's gone as a whole with, his level of play, the injury. By the time this season ends, he'll be, corner that's 29 going on 30. And so, to go from having your cornerback one established to this Michael Davis thing happening, plus the JC injury, it is kind of a bummer, but at the same time, Chargers gave him that $40 million guaranteed. And if they have it paid off by this year and they can afford to give him the post-June 1st designation cut, we'll have to see how 2023 plays out, but obviously only getting 2 years, less than that out of J.C. Jackson because of the injury in year 1, potentially less than 2 years of production out of J.C. Jackson on that 5-year deal with all the guaranteed money up front. It would be a disappointment. And I think right now you have to talk about J.C. Jackson as though he is probably less likely to play year 3 of this contract than not, right? And so ultimately that's why in this article piece that I have written over here, I ended up giving J.C. Jackson a D with all the factors that, I've considered for this exercise. But sorry to end the video on a bummer note. I don't want to end the video on a bummer grade, but we are only a month away from free agency now. Let me know what you guys think about the 2022 free agent class, a year after, down in the comments below. Let me know if you guys have some 2023 free agency names, and we can talk about those in the comments down below as well. As always, I'm doing work over on Bolt Beat. The guys have the show over here, and I'm doing Bolt breakdowns over here too. So if you throw us a subscribe, throw us a like, it would be very much appreciated. But that is all for this episode. I will see you guys next time.